Hey everybody, welcome to SNY's breaking news coverage. I am Doug Williams. Trevor Bauer has decided to become a Los Angeles Dodger after a lot of conversation involving the Mets that it potentially was down to two teams. It turns out the Dodgers win out for his services. We will be joined by Andy Martino and Jim Duquette to discuss what this means for the Mets moving forward. Gentlemen, welcome to you both. Andy, I'd like to start with you. From what you're aware of right now in your reporting, why did Trevor Bauer decide not to go to the New York Mets?
Well, I haven't checked all the online platforms yet on which I assume he's posting his reasoning sort of as we prepared for air. There was one where he just kind of unveiled himself in a Dodger uniform. So, look, when we find out the terms of the contract, it'll be more clear why he made that choice. We know he's a California guy, and that could be a factor in terms of going home. If they offered him a one-year deal, which I know there was some thought in the industry that it was going to be 1 year at a high rate for Bauer, that gives him a chance to test the free agent market again. It's not one that I bet Jim would have recommended had we been the agents, but we're not the agents. So anyway, he's going to the Dodgers, and the Mets still had a really good offseason. They got Francisco Lindor, and they have a good team. So at least we get to stop checking all these online places.
Andy, just as you were saying that, Jeff Passan has tweeted out, Trevor Bauer and the Dodgers are in agreement on a 3-year deal that has opt-outs after years 1 and 2.
Well, that's a 1-year deal.
So you think Trevor Bauer signed that contract viewing it himself as a 1-year deal? That's what he wanted?
It is, because it's 1 year of team control. I mean, the Mets are offering the same, so that gets interesting as we start to report out what the differences were. And again, with Bauer, I'm not trying to dodge the question, but he's sort of cornered the market on sharing his own thoughts at great length with the world. So we'll see how he spins that out. I know from the Mets' perspective, they were willing to do something like that, but weren't going to go crazy to beat something like that either.
You know, I think with this, what you're trying to do in any negotiation, if you're the agent, and listen, there's a challenge with the agent because Rachel Luba is a first-time agent. This is our only client. She has 2 clients. Well, this is the highest profile in Trevor Bauer. And so you're trying to get the most money here. And I think that there was only 2 teams in the end, Dodgers and Mets, as we know. But the Mets, you know, there had been leaked out that there was an offer on the table for 3 years, but one, you know, with an opt-out after 1 and after 2 years. The Dodgers, if you're Andrew Friedman, know where that endpoint is. And so to hear that, and we were starting to hear this late this morning, that they may match or closer to the Mets number than originally thought. The lure of going back home, because he's from Los Angeles, went to UCLA. I think there's some things there that stood out to me that I think it was going to be hard for the Mets to compete at the end if the offers were close.
All right, this is from Mark Feinstein, and Jim, I'm going to come back to you here with these numbers. He gets $102 million for 3 years from the Dodgers. He has opt-outs, obviously, after the first 2. It's $40 million in 2021, $45 million in 2022. He's going to be the highest-paid player in baseball history in 21 and again in 22. So, Jim, from your front office perspective, do you think that is specific to this player? Or do you think it's just so clear that teams are much more willing to pay a lot for 1 or 2 years and less willing to go long term, which hamstrings you in the future?
Yeah, I think there's a combination of things, right? So if you go and look at Trevor Bauer, we know that there's some issues there off the field, social media side of things. Clearly, you know, I go back, when you have, let's say a little bit of a risk with players, you tend to want a shorter term deal. You know, I remember the Mets when Sandy Alderson signed, went to Cespedes. That was certainly one of those factors. Market kind of dictated how long of a term you want that you'd want to put in there. I also think that Trevor Bauer had talked about trying to get the highest AAV in the sport. Garrett Cole, who's a former teammate of Bauer's, had the highest AAV, of course, there with the Yankees. And so if his goal was to get the highest AAV in the sport as a pitcher, well, he certainly accomplished that in this. So I think a lot of this is your personal goal, what you're trying to accomplish versus, what obviously the teams are willing to do. And I think both teams, Mets and Dodgers, found an attractiveness in a shorter term deal. So because of that, Trevor Bauer was asking for the higher AAV. That's why you're seeing that number of 40, which is mind-boggling in some degree, in some thoughts. I never thought we'd see a starting pitcher get to that $40 million threshold.
Yeah, I think also that the Mets would have gone close to that, wouldn't have gone quite there. So that actually, now that we have those numbers as we've been on the air, kind of answers, Doug, your earlier question, fills in the blanks a little on some of the back and forth of why he chose the Dodgers and why it's not the Mets. Sandy Alderson and the Mets knew what they were willing to do. Alderson and Steve Cohen have been, I think, very rightly sensitive all winter about not being used by teams just to drive up the price because there's a perception that they're going to spend wildly under Cohen. So they had their offer. It was sitting on the table. It was there last night. There was so much going on Twitter and different places about deal, no deal, this, that, the other thing. But what was actually happening with the Mets was like, here's what we're willing to do. And I think it was just short of $100 million, same length, same idea of opt-outs. And that's where they were. So if the Dodgers wanted to beat that, then they were going to be able to get Bauer, and they did go ahead and do that. And it seems pretty simple that way. The Mets were close, but not willing to keep escalating with another team that was in it.
Jim, this was the last remaining free agent splash that Steve Cohen and Sandy Alderson could have made. They obviously don't end up doing that. Bauer in particular, though, how much of a loss do you think it is for this Mets team to not have ended up with him?
Well, I think that they have enough talent right now to win the division in the NL East. And, you know, it's always about who you're competing against, obviously, not only within your division, but within the National League to get to the World Series. They have a little ways to go to catch, I think, the Dodgers now that Bauer has signed, and in terms of chasing that World Series appearance and World Series title that Steve Cohen, Sandy Alderson are trying to get. But their pitching right now is strong enough. I still would like to see if they could get a little bit more depth until Syndergaard comes back, and maybe that's a Taijuan Walker or Jake Odorizzi or somebody along those lines. But they also have the room to go out and get a center fielder if they want with Jackie Bradley Jr. They could add a relief pitcher. There's some things that they could do to be better. And I think for me, as much as I like Bauer as a pitcher, I think there would have been some issues in New York if he struggled out of the gate. And so, I think with this, time will tell. But if you don't want to be in New York, I think it's better to turn the page and see if they can improve in some other areas for the Mets.
I agree with Jim on all points, but highlighting your last point, Jim, this was always a dicey proposition for the Mets, but look, whether Bauer's behavior was harassment, whether it was this or that, I'm not in the business of trying to label these things or compare them to what other men have done that have been associated with the Mets. But he made people feel uncomfortable online. He made women feel comfortable online. We know what he is. He's, I believe, a 30-year-old man. It's not as if you're going to change overnight when you sign with a new team. So that's the whole package that the Mets would have been importing with the context of what's going on with Jared Porter and Mickey Callaway. Different offenses, but still, one of the things that would have also led to is for all that money that the Mets would have spent, it wouldn't have been a clear PR win. When I've been reporting, on this on Twitter, you'll see the replies sometimes, and there's fans going, go get him. And there's a lot of fans going, please don't, Sandy, don't bring this guy to New York, especially after what's happened. So the introductory press conference for an historic outlay of cash would have been filled with questions about what kind of diligence did you do, and was this harassment or wasn't. And even on day one, it wouldn't have been just that PR win that you hope when you spend all that money. And then, as Jim pointed out, spinning it forward, there's the potential for things to happen in the future with a mercurial personality. Look, Bauer's entertaining. People that have dealt with him one-on-one like him, I don't want to paint him as some monster. I'm not trying to do that. But we know that there's the potential, especially in New York, for some things to get out of control if he doesn't perform.
One more note here from Jeff Passan. He says the Mets offered a higher overall value than the Dodgers, but those numbers in the first 2 years of Bauer's deal are massive, and making him the highest paid player in baseball history was certainly appealing to him. Who wouldn't it be appealing to? Andy, so let's talk about pivots. Jim mentioned some names to add to that rotation depth. I would add James Paxton maybe to that list if the Mets like him as a potential add there. What about Jackie Bradley Jr.? We've heard high numbers potentially from his side. Do you think the Mets see that as their next potential pivot?
Look, I think they're in pretty good shape with the rotation. Carlos Carrasco was a big get And they've got depth now, too. Obviously, you've got Peterson. They've signed some really good depth guys, whether it's Yamamoto from the Marlins or others. They've added nicely. Paxton had a showcase a while back, which, unlike Kluber, did not generate a ton of interest. Makes you wonder. Paxton's a great guy, a great pitcher. I hope he's doing okay. But I think it's interesting that we haven't heard a ton there. And as far as your Bradley question, Doug, they've been in on Bradley. They've been talking to him. He has wanted a significant contract. We've been talking about that for a while. 4 or 5 or more years, $15, $20 million a year, something like that would be where Scott Boras and Bradley are at. So we'll see. But now that you haven't spent that money on Bauer, they really can make decisions like that. And I think improve their club. I think because the Mets rotation is already good, you can make an argument, a baseball operations argument, that their roster will be better off by spreading these resources around a bit.
I've talked to you both enough about front offices and the way they think to know that they don't think like fans, right? So to Andy's earlier point, the Mets had that window where they were comfortable with Trevor Bauer. He didn't accept it. And now they probably just move on, Jim, but they move on having not spent money on George Springer, having not spent money on Trevor Bauer. And I think there's a lot of Mets fans at home who are upset about that. But, Jim, what about the front office view then on using that money that you've now saved on somebody like Francisco Lindor an extension or Michael Conforto an extension?
Well, I think that's another thing that kind of goes without saying. You know, they missed out on Realmuto too, but they obviously had gotten McCann. I think you're in this point where if you're going to wait this long in the wintertime, you better have most of your roster set, and luckily the Mets do. And so I think with, as most of these guys, the main guys are off the table, you see what else can fit within your roster that you can add on a either short-term or long-term basis. Nothing to that degree of those high-impact guys. And then you turn your sights towards keeping Lindor and Conforto. I always felt that it was not an either-or. It was both. How could they go down both paths? So if they got Bauer, yeah, it might impact, how much you could pay Lindor or Conforto. But the hope was that they could afford all of them. And so I think at some point you certainly go down, that road of trying to sign those guys up prior to opening day for both. I know Conforto said he didn't want it to be a distraction. Lindor sounded like he didn't want it to go into the course of the season. But I think you can do both. You can still improve the team, add the depth that you're hoping for, but also try to ink both of those players to long-term deals.
So just some more numbers quickly from Joel Sherman just now. Mets went after Bauer hard. Offer was roughly 3 years, 110. Similar opt-outs, but, and I put this in quotes, only $40 million for those first 2 years. So again, if Trevor Bauer were to opt out after year one, he'd be opting out of a contract that would make him still the richest player in baseball history per year. So I don't see that happening. I don't really know why anybody would. So I think on paper, this looks like a 2-year deal that he and Rachel Luba have negotiated for, even though there's an opt-out there. I'm not sure why he would use it. But again, Trevor Bauer headed to the Los Angeles Dodgers. And the Mets are left to wonder what might be next for them, as we just have a couple more days left in the offseason for them to improve on their club before they head down to Port St. Lucie. We will have plenty more at 6 o'clock on Baseball Night in New York. For now, this ends our breaking news coverage on SNY's social media platforms. Andy Martino and Jim Duquette, thank you both. We'll see you at 6 o'clock. Thanks for watching, everybody.